Who fired her? Nobody in that building could answer. Eleanor Prescott carried a small cardboard box past rows of silent desks, holding it against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Inside were 3 items: a photograph of 2 children who were not hers by birth but were hers by every measure that mattered, a chipped coffee mug that said, "World's okayest grandma," and a folded letter she had never had the courage to open. No one looked up as she passed. No one offered to carry the box. And certainly no one in that office knew that the woman they had just dismissed from a cleaning contract owned the deed to the very building they worked in. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Eleanor had not always mopped floors for a living. Decades earlier, she and her late husband, Walter, built a small property management firm out of a rented office with 2 desks and a second-hand phone line. They worked side by side for years, learning zoning laws at the kitchen table after their daughter had gone to bed, saving every spare dollar to buy their second building, then their third. Walter used to say that the company was never really about the buildings. It was about proving to each other that 2 people with nothing could build something worth keeping. Eleanor believed him completely, and for 18 years, that belief carried them through every setback the business handed them. When Walter died suddenly of a heart condition no one had caught in time, Eleanor could have sold the company and walked away wealthy for the rest of her life. Instead, she quietly stepped back from public life, placed the business in the hands of trusted managers, and grieved in a way that made her disappear from the circles she once moved through. 3 years later, her daughter Colleen died in a car accident on a rainy interstate, leaving behind 2 children, 8 and 11, with nowhere else to go. Eleanor did not hesitate. She sold her house in the city, moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental near their school, and rebuilt her entire life around bedtime stories, packed lunches, and parent-teacher conferences. Money had never been the thing she wanted people to know about her, and now it mattered even less. She wanted her grandchildren to see a woman get up every morning and work, not a woman who inherited comfort and never had to try. So she took a modest job cleaning the very corporate offices her own company owned, using her late husband's mother's maiden name, Foss, on the employee roster, and told no one. Not her attorney, not her accountant, not even the 2 board members who still handled her holdings on her behalf. She wanted, for the first time in decades, to simply be a woman doing an honest day's work, invisible in the best possible way. For 6 years, Eleanor arrived before sunrise, emptied trash bins, wiped down conference tables, and left before most employees walked in. On the mornings her grandson had a fever, she brought him to the break room in his pajamas and let him sleep on 2 pushed-together chairs while she finished her rounds. On the evenings her granddaughter had a school recital. She traded shifts with a coworker so she would never miss a single one. The people who did see her rarely said her name. Some assumed she had no family, others assumed she had no ambition. Nobody imagined that the tired woman pushing a cleaning cart had once negotiated multi-million-dollar leases in rooms, exactly like the ones she now wiped down every night. A new facilities manager, Dale Huckabee, took an immediate dislike to her quiet manner, the same way some men mistake gentleness for weakness. He mocked her for being slow on the stairs. He mocked the faded cardigan she wore every winter, the same one her husband had bought her the year before he passed. He scheduled her shifts to overlap with her grandchildren's school pickup times, knowing full well it created problems for her, and seemed almost pleased when she had to ask for adjustments. Eleanor never answered back. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to someone determined to misunderstand her was a waste of the only hours she had left with her grandchildren each evening. Her coworkers noticed the pattern, but no one wanted to be Dale's next target, so the quiet cruelty continued. Week after week, unremarked and unchallenged. One afternoon, Dale called a floor meeting simply to announce a new dress code for custodial staff, one that ignored the fact that cleaning solutions ruined anything but the cheapest fabric. When Eleanor asked, respectfully, whether the company could provide a small uniform allowance, Dale laughed in front of 6 coworkers and told her that people who wanted better clothing should have built better careers when they had the chance. Eleanor said nothing. She simply nodded once and went back to work, though one coworker later said she saw Eleanor's hands trembling slightly as she gripped her cart down the hallway. It was the closest anyone had come to seeing her upset in 6 years. One morning, Eleanor's granddaughter called in tears. A school fee was due that afternoon and there was no one else to bring it, since her grandson had a dentist appointment the same hour. Eleanor asked Dale for 20 minutes to leave and return. Dale refused, loudly, in front of 3 other staff members, and told her that people who could not commit to a schedule did not belong on his team. Eleanor explained calmly that she had never once missed a shift in 6 years, and that 20 minutes would not disrupt anything. Dale cut her off mid-sentence and told her he was tired of hearing excuses from people who treated the job as optional. Eleanor left anyway, because a frightened 12-year-old mattered more to her than a man's temper. When Eleanor came back exactly 22 minutes later, Dale was waiting with a termination form already printed, as though he had been hoping for the excuse. He did not ask why she had left. He did not ask how long she had worked there, or whether she had ever been late before, or what might have called her away on such short notice. He handed her the box himself, already packed by a junior staffer under his instruction, and told her to be out within the hour. A few coworkers lowered their eyes. One mouthed a silent apology she never saw. No one, not one person in that hallway, said a word in her defense. Eleanor packed her 3 belongings without a word and walked toward the exit, past the same conference rooms she had cleaned 1,000 times, past the lobby directory that still listed a company she alone had built from a rented office and a second-hand phone line. Outside, she sat on the low concrete wall near the entrance, the box on her lap, watching the traffic pass like it belonged to someone else's morning. She had built this company from nothing. She had signed the papers for this very building, and still, a man half her age had just told her she did not belong. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of Walter, thinking of Colleen, thinking of every quiet sacrifice that had led her to this bench. Then, without warning, a black car pulled to the curb. A man in his 60s stepped out too quickly, adjusting his coat as he walked toward her. It was Gerald Ashworth, the company's longtime board chairman, one of only 4 people alive who knew who Eleanor really was. He had been trying to reach her for 2 days after a routine audit flagged unusual overtime patterns in the facilities department, patterns that led an assistant to quietly pull the personnel file of an employee named E. Foss. When Gerald saw the emergency contact number listed on that file, he recognized it instantly as Eleanor's cell phone, and he had not been able to breathe normally since. When building security told him a cleaning employee by that name had just been terminated that very morning, his stomach dropped before he even confirmed it. Now, seeing Eleanor sitting outside with a cardboard box on her knees, he understood everything at once, and his face went pale in a way none of his employees had ever seen. At that same moment, the CEO of the company, Renata Voss, arrived for a scheduled site visit she had postponed twice already that month. She noticed the unusual hush in the lobby before she noticed anything else, the kind of silence that follows an event no one wants to describe out loud. An assistant whispered that facilities had let someone go that morning, someone who had apparently worked there for years without incident. Another mentioned, almost in passing, that Gerald Ashworth's car had just pulled up outside for no listed reason, which was strange, since board chairmen did not typically appear in person over a custodial staffing matter. Curious, and slightly unsettled, Renata stepped through the glass doors and stopped mid-stride. Gerald Ashworth was crouched beside a cleaning employee on the low wall, speaking to her the way one speaks to someone far above their own rank, not below it. Renata heard him say the words, "Mrs. Prescott, I am so sorry," and something about the tone made her chest tighten. She had never heard Gerald apologize to anyone in the 11 years she had worked with him. She walked closer, and Dale Huckabee, who had followed her out to explain his morning's decision, went completely still beside her, his explanation dying somewhere in his throat. Renata turned to the small crowd gathering near the entrance and asked the only question that mattered: who fired her? No one answered right away. Then, slowly, 3 coworkers turned toward Dale. His hands were shaking before he even opened his mouth to speak, and for the first time since he had taken the job, he had absolutely nothing to say. Gerald stood and addressed the small crowd directly, his voice unsteady but clear. Eleanor Prescott was not simply a former cleaning employee. She was the founder and sole owner of the company that employed every person standing in that lobby, including Dale. Her holdings, built over 3 decades with her late husband and expanded quietly since his passing, were worth well over $400 million. She had chosen, for reasons that were entirely her own, to work quietly among the people whose lives her decisions affected every day, drawing no salary from the very role she had just been dismissed from. Gasps moved through the small crowd. A coworker covered her mouth. Dale's face lost all its color, and he took a half-step backward as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Eleanor simply sat there, hands folded, no anger in her expression at all, only a tiredness that went deeper than the morning's events. Renata felt something close to shame settle over her, heavier than anything she had felt in years running the company. How many mornings had she walked past this woman in the hallway without a glance? How many small kindnesses had the company overlooked because a faded cardigan and a quiet voice did not look like power? She thought of every policy memo she had signed without asking who it would affect on the ground floor, every budget cut that trimmed staff hours without a second thought. Eleanor finally stood, steadying herself against the wall, and looked at the building she had built from nothing, its glass front catching the late morning light. She told them that money had never once made her happier than the mornings she braided her granddaughter's hair before school, or the evenings her grandson read his homework out loud at the kitchen table, sounding out words he was still learning. She said people rarely know what another person is carrying, and that a tired woman with a cardboard box deserves the same respect as anyone in a corner office, because dignity was never supposed to depend on a job title. Dale dropped his gaze first, then his composure entirely. He admitted, quietly, that he had judged her because she looked like someone with nothing left to offer, someone he assumed had failed at something to end up where she was. He said he was ashamed, and that he did not know how he would ever undo 6 years of small cruelties toward a woman who had never once raised her voice at him. Eleanor did not raise her voice now either. She told him that holding on to anger costs more than it ever returns, and that she would rather spend her remaining years building something than tearing someone down for a mistake he could still choose to learn from. Gerald, watching quietly, thought it was the most Eleanor thing she could have possibly said. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor did not seek to punish anyone, though the board urged her to remove Dale immediately. Instead, she restructured the company's policies from the ground up, paid family leave for employees raising children alone, a uniform and equipment allowance for every custodial worker, a scholarship fund for staff members' grandchildren, and a standing rule that no employee could be terminated without a second manager and a documented reason present. She personally reviewed every complaint filed by facilities staff over the previous 3 years, and quietly corrected the ones that had gone ignored. Dale kept his job, on the condition that he spend a full year working alongside the very cleaning staff he had once dismissed, learning their names, their hours, and the weight of the carts he had never once offered to help push. He later said, in a small interview for the company newsletter, that it was the most humbling and necessary year of his life, and that he thought of Eleanor every single morning he clocked in. Months later, at the company's annual gathering, Eleanor stood at the back of the room, the way she always had, her granddaughter's hand in hers, and her grandson tugging gently at her sleeve to ask when dinner would be served. She was no longer invisible to the people around her, though she never once asked to be seen, and she still wore the same faded cardigan, now mended at the elbow rather than replaced. Co-workers who had once walked past her without a glance now stopped to introduce their own children, their own parents, their own quiet struggles they had never felt safe mentioning before. As the evening wound down, her granddaughter looked up and asked if her mother would have been proud. Eleanor looked toward the window, tears gathering quietly, and said that pain never fully leaves a person, but kindness gives it somewhere to rest, and that was the only thing she had ever really tried to build. Before this video ends, tell us in the comments, if you were Eleanor, would you have chosen forgiveness, or would you have walked away for good? If this story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one, because sometimes the tired woman with a cardboard box is not someone who failed. Sometimes she built the entire building, and sometimes she simply wanted to be treated like a person before anyone knew her name.